Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of very special Stern Fireside Chat. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Raghu Sundaram. I'm the Dean of the Stern School of Business. I have the pleasure of welcoming not only all of you here tonight, but a very special guest, Robert Rubin, former Treasury Secretary of the United States, amongst many other things. As many of you know, we've hosted a number of very special fireside chats featuring speakers like Paul Krugman, Alan Greenspan, Anna Wintour, Henry Kissinger, people who've needed no introduction at all. And today's guest not only falls into that group, certainly is probably amongst the most elite members of that group. But being a professor, it's not enough to say he doesn't need an introduction. I'm going to do one anyway. But I will keep it very, very brief. And I'll just mention a few highlights of Secretary Rubin's career. Robert Rubin was Treasury Secretary under President Bill Clinton between 1995 and 1999. It was the first time in about 30 years or 40 years the US budget deficit went into a surplus. That's one particular reason we all remember his tenure very well. Before his government service, he spent 26 years at Goldman Sachs, eventually serving as a member of the board and as co-chairman from 90 to 92. Subsequently, he served as senior advisor to many different financial firms, including Citigroup and to Centerview Partners. He is chairman emeritus of the Council for Foreign Relations, and he serves as founder of the Hamilton Project, which focuses on ways to promote inclusive growth. He is the author of In an Uncertain World, Tough Choices from Wall Street to Washington. Mr. Rubin holds an undergraduate degree from Harvard University in economics, summa cum laude, and a degree in law from Yale, plus many, many other honorary degrees. This is not his first visit here. We've been lucky to have him here in this building many times, both in open fora like this, but also as members of as participants in individual classes. And we are very grateful to him for his presence here today, for his continued support of the school. Joining Mr. Rubin on stage is Professor Kim Schoenholtz, who's the director of Stern Center for Global Economy and Business. So without further ado, let me welcome you all to today's event. Kim, all yours.
Thank you, Raghu. So first of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dean Sundaram, and thank you, former Secretary Rubin, for being here today. We're going to just highlight for you how you will be able to submit questions and vote on the questions. So if we can just get the slide, there you go. If you use your either your laptop or your cell phone, your smartphone, and log on to slido.com, slido.com, and enter the event number 6666, you'll be able to see the questions that are there. You'll be able to submit questions, and you can vote on the questions. So your participation helps determine exactly the questions that we pose to the former Secretary of the Treasury. We hope you'll be active in doing that. Before we begin with the Q&A, we're fortunate that former Secretary Rubin is going to offer brief remarks that set the stage for our discussion. Without further ado, thank you very much.
Yeah, this is going to be very brief. Kim and I talked about this, and we thought maybe it would be useful just to have a few framing comments. And basically my view on policy, the United States economy, and the like. My fundamental view is that if you take a look at the longer term, I think we have enormous strengths and comparative advantages. I would rather do business in the United States. I'd rather invest in the United States. I'd rather be engaged in economic activity in the United States than any other country, including, I might add, China, although I think China's prospects are probably very bright. However, if we're going to succeed in the way that I just described, and I would describe success, by the way, as meeting two objectives: one, strong growth, and two, widespread economic well-being, decreased inequality. And I think that those two objectives are interdependent. That is to say, I don't think you're going to get widespread economic well-being unless you have growth. I don't think you're going to get growth unless you get widespread economic well-being. To realize these potentials, I think we have to meet hugely consequential policy challenges. And that, I think, is the key to the question of what kind of economy we're going to have in the years and decades to come. We need to have a sound fiscal regime. We need to have very substantial public investment in a wide array of areas. We'll discuss that if you want. And we need structural reform in all kinds of ways, immigration reform and healthcare, climate change, healthcare costs, healthcare universal coverage, climate change, and so forth. The question then is our political system. And I would argue that at least for the last 15 or plus years, the political system has addressed almost, well, has not addressed, let us put it this way, has not addressed the great predominance of our economic policy challenges. And the question is, going forward, is this going to continue to be the case, in which case I think that speaks very troublingly to the future of our economic system, or will that change and we get back on track in terms of our ability to function politically? And by functioning politically, I mean the following. I mean there's got to be a willingness to engage in principled compromise, because you cannot get anything done. Well, you can get some done. You can get virtually nothing done with respect to the predominance of our challenges unless you have a willingness to compromise across policy and political divides. There also has to be a willingness to ground decisions in fact and analysis, while recognizing that politics will always be involved. And there needs to be a willingness to make difficult decisions, though as you talk about decisions with longer-term consequences, that is very difficult in any democracy, very much including ours. As far as the future is concerned, I've stayed very involved politically and in policy, one thing or another. And I think a lot of people involved in all of this are pretty troubled about the political outlook for this country. I have a somewhat more affirmative view. We clearly are going through a very difficult period and have been, as I say, for the roughly last 15 years, largely because there's been unwillingness in Congress to engage in principled compromise. But we are a dynamic society. Politics can change rapidly in this country. So I'm inclined to think that over time, and we are, at least have been historically, a resilient political system. So I'm inclined to think over time the odds are probably pretty good that we'll get back on track. It could be long, it could be messy, there are no guarantees, and I think there could be a lot of change in our party system and in many other ways in order to get where we need to be. Let me make two more comments, then I'm finished. One, there's a lot of criticism of our market-based economic system, and it's justified, I think well justified, in terms of the adverse conditions that we are experiencing in all kinds of ways. But I don't think the problem is a market-based economic system. There is no successful economy in the world today that isn't committed pretty much to market-based economics. In China and India, growth only really began in 1990 with Finance Minister Singh, and in China in 1978 with President Deng. It only began when a commitment was put in place for market-based economic reform. And China is a very complicated situation right now in that regard, but even there in the third plenum they recommitted to reform, and they continue to articulate a commitment to reform, though as I say it's gotten a little bit more complicated. The problem is that markets by their nature, market-based systems by their nature, are not going to deal with a whole host of issues, and therefore market-based economy has to be combined with a strong economic system, strong political system that is effective in the respects that I've just mentioned, and it can deal with the hugely consequential challenges that a market-based system won't address. Secondly, we have an ever-worsening fiscal situation, and debt to GDP is roughly 78% right now. CBO is estimated to be somewhere around 95%. There actually are different estimates, but say somewhere around 95% 10 years from now. There are some people who say that deficits don't matter anymore. I think inevitably, if you take that view and if you have policy based on that view, sooner or later, you will pay a very, very big price for it. So I think we've got to get back on track somehow or other fiscally. Now, the problem is we also have a great deal to do that is going to take additional resource. So I think we need very substantially increased revenues, which can be raised on a progressive basis in many different ways, not just some of those that have been laid out, or proposed, I should say. And secondly, as you all know, and this is my last comment, our healthcare system costs us about 18% of GDP. The average of the developed world is somewhere around 10%. You can get the exact number, but it's in that area. So there's obviously a tremendous difference between us and the rest of the developed world. And it's not that we have better outcomes. It's just that we have more cost. So I think there's a great deal that can be had. Now, we also have some more difficult demographics, one thing or another. There are factors that are maybe peculiar to us, but I think there's a lot to be saved in terms of our overall healthcare system, which in turn was funneled through to our healthcare entitlements, which is largely what drives the, in large measure at least, what drives our future fiscal position. But the politics of all this are very difficult, so it comes back to what I said before, and it is my basic view of this. Economic issues are complex. If you're going to have effective responses to them, they're going to be complex. And for a political system to deal with all this, there's got to be willingness to compromise, a willingness to make difficult decisions, and a willingness to ground decisions in fact analysis, allowing for the fact that politics will always be involved. And the question for the future of our country is, will we get back to that or won't we? Your nickel.
Thank you very much. My nickel went a long way.
Right.
So just a reminder, you can now be submitting questions, but if you do, you have to provide your full name. We will not show questions that are anonymous or incomplete. So top voted question right now is to ask you to pull out your crystal ball and tell us, if there is a recession sometime in the next few years, what do you think will be the cause?
What do I think will be the cause?
The cause.
Huh. That's not the question I would have thought somebody would have asked. Okay. What would have been the cause? Well, you could have a geopolitical event, right? You could have just a natural slowing. Our economy's going on for a long time. The tax cut in 2017, which I called a fiscal tragedy in a Washington Post op-ed I wrote, is estimated pretty broadly, I think, to maybe contributed, Kim, 0.3% or something to growth last year. But as you and I were discussing the other day, or last night, I guess it was, it's kind of phasing out now, so there could be the phasing out of that. Hopefully this trade dispute with China will be worked out in some fashion, which isn't just a question of us buying more soybeans, but actually goes to some of the structural issues that are involved. But there's possible stress there. The EU is clearly slowing down, so global conditions. And China's slowing down. Their official rate, they're now talking about official growth rate of 6%. But Kim, you and I were discussing, I know people who are very thoughtful about China and very knowledgeable who think the actual rate is probably substantially below that. So all of that could come together. And then I'd add one more thing, which is what so often causes the problem, which is the thing none of us can anticipate. What worries me is if we get a recession, what we need to do, and you all know this, you need to put in place a fiscal stimulus to get yourself back on. By the way, another thing I add is the stock market has gone up one heck of a lot over the last 10 years. And is it overvalued, undervalued right now? I don't have the foggiest notion. But markets that have gone up that far for that long at least have the possibility of going back down, and that could create trouble. What worries me is if we get a recession, will the political system be effective in doing what Obama did in 2009, which is put in place a stimulus of sufficient magnitude to get us back on track?
Okay.
And the Fed doesn't have as much room as they used to have because rates are pretty low.
Actually, that was one of the next questions that was coming up. In the event that we do have a recession.
Do you disagree with what I just said?
I honestly don't have a good forecast for what would cause a recession.
I was talking about if we
conditional.
Yeah.
And if somebody asked me what would I put up at the top of the list, I'd put the policy mistakes here at home and policy mistakes abroad. Yeah. With the economy abroad slowing, it's easy to get both kinds of mistakes. So related to that, someone asked the question, if we do have a recession, what are the policies that ought to be put in place? They're asking, what about the monetary policy? Should we have negative interest rates? Should we have unconventional monetary policy, fiscal policy, given the deficits? Where would you go with that?
Look, one of the problems of the trajectory that we have is that the resilience that we need, resilience consists of what? It consists of fiscal policy and monetary policy. But in terms of fiscal policy, we're already, as I said, at roughly 77, 78% of GDP. So we put ourselves in a less favorable position than we would be if we'd had sound fiscal policy for a long period of time. And if you go into a mode of fiscal stimulus, which what I think we should do, first place, the politics of that are going to be more difficult than it would be if we had a lower debt to GDP ratio. But secondly, you can reach a point where even though you need the stimulus, your debt to GDP ratio is at a high enough level. I'm not saying we're there, I don't think we are, but a high enough level. So there is some risk in taking it further. But I think one thing, we should have stimulus. I don't think we're going to have problems in our financial system like we did last time. I think at least the big institutions, I think, are on pretty solid footing. If we have a stock market, a serious stock market decline, that we don't really have a way of dealing with that other than to try to have sound policy in general, though I think that there's a lot to be said for having, in fact, a tremendous amount to be said, for having confidence in our markets and in our economy, and that means not attacking the Fed, but supporting the independence of the Fed. I used to say, President Clinton, and Clinton absolutely related to this, that you don't attack the independence of the Fed, partly because you need an independent Fed that can make non-political decisions about monetary policy, but secondly, it really does contribute to the credibility of our markets. And when you attack the independence of the Fed, I think you act in a way that can to some degree undermine the credibility of our markets. So I would say that. And then Fed policy, they would have to ease. Would you go to negative rates? You know, there's a big debate about whether negative rates are a good idea or a bad idea. I think I probably wouldn't go to, depends on the survey. I probably wouldn't go to negative rates, but you might do another QE or something like that. I don't know, what do you think?
So far, I don't think the evidence for negative rates has been that effective, but I wouldn't rule it out.
No, I wouldn't rule out anything. So I agree with that.
Okay.
But I wouldn't rule out anything. But I would be inclined, I'd probably be inclined to go to QE before I went to negative rates, I think.
China,
but
U.S.
confidence is so, I think, unfortunately, we have a situation now where, in one sense, there's a certain amount of confidence because we've had a strong economy for a long time. In another sense, I think I'm still in the investment banking business, so I have a lot of interaction with companies. Well, not a lot, but a reasonable amount. And I think there was a lot of concern about whether our government is on a sensible and sound path. A lot of business people liked the tax cut. I think they were just opting for short-term maximization when, in fact, we created a terrible and exacerbated a long-term problem. And they like deregulation. The problem with deregulation is you need to do it in a cost-benefit framework and not sort of an ad hoc framework. But I also think there's a lot of concern about our political system in all kinds of ways, not just with respect to the administration.
We've seen a really, putting on your CFR hat, we've seen a very large change in relations between China and the United States over the last couple of years. Where are we headed? Thinking beyond the Trump administration, what's the medium-term and long-term outlook for U.S.-China relations?
It will be what it will be, I think. No, I mean that seriously. I think it's I'm speaking 2 weeks from now at the China Development, about roughly 2 weeks from now at the China Development Forum in Beijing, and I'm just writing my remarks over the weekend. And I was thinking about this. Kim, I think we have an overwhelming imperative to have a constructive relationship. Climate change is existential, at least in my view. And I don't think the globe is going to deal with climate change unless the U.S. and China together, do what they need to do, and then work to catalyze a response on the part of the rest of the world. In a sense, that's how the Paris Treaty came about. Of course, we've now pulled out of that, which was, I think, I think that also was semi-tragic, but except that it probably wasn't accomplishing much anyway, so maybe it didn't matter that much. But at least it was a statement of purpose. It did have that. So what will it be? I don't know. There are a lot of voices on both sides of the Pacific who are now saying that we should focus on nationalistic objectives and not look toward a constructive relationship. And in the United States, at least, if you go back 5 years or so, and much before that, the business community was always very strongly in favor of a constructive relationship, but the structural issues, not the trade deficit, which is, as you all probably well know, not relevant to anything, the bilateral trade deficit, but the structural issues, I think, really have caused quite a change in the business community in terms of their attitude toward China. I think it's imperative that we have a constructive relationship for both our countries. Climate change, nuclear weaponry, cyber crime, cyber terrorism, pandemics, terrorism more generally. These are all issues that need to be dealt with transnationally, and the transnational institutions have lost most of their ability to function. So I think it ultimately depends on whether or not our two countries come together. But whether we will or not, and it probably has to be sometime after this administration, since they don't seem inclined to do that.
The next question is about tools that could be used to address income and wealth inequality. The one that's focused on is universal basic income. But just to broaden the question, what tools do you think make sense for trying to address income inequality?
Well, I think I had an op-ed in the New York Times a year or two ago about the UBI. I think it is a genuinely not good idea. Here's what I think we should do. I think there's a lot we should do. We should have a whole inclusive growth agenda with all kinds of dimensions to it. But it means you've got to also raise resources, and that's why I think we're going to have to increase revenue substantially on a progressive basis. For example, I don't mean to digress, but just is on my mind at the moment. It has been for a little bit. If you deal with the various exemptions and credits, base broadening on the individual level, base broadening on the corporate level. If you take the corporate level back to, say, 25% or something like that, which CEOs would have been absolutely willing to sign on to until we got the 21% rate, you raise the estate tax. Well, even if you don't raise the estate tax, you eliminate stepped-up bases of death. You take a number of other measures. You raise a lot of money, Kim. I mean, I've actually seen this analysis. You raise a lot of money. Then I think you need to spend money on all sorts of, for example, I would have subsidized lifelong learning, subsidized apprenticeships, basic research, infrastructure, and a whole host of measures of that sort, immigration reform, so we have a sensible set of policies, climate change we've got to deal with, I haven't doubt, overcoming poverty. Poverty is a tremendous economic drag for all of us. Close to 20% of America's kids live in poverty. That cannot be a sensible place to be in terms of the future of our economy. Criminal justice reform, I think, is actually an economic issue. This and many, many other things I haven't mentioned, regulatory reform and a cost-benefit construct. If you do all this, I think you create an economy in which people have the opportunity and the potential to do well. I think that you would increase median real incomes. You would bring down the economic position of the most affluent because you would have increased your taxes on a progressive basis, substantially. And I think that's in a broad. But the politics of all this are really difficult. And what we've got to do over time is have a political system that is willing to make decisions on the basis I said before, and then willing to work together to move forward on these objectives. And people have different views, but if people... Marty Feldstein is one of the most distinguished economists in America, is a conservative Republican. Marty told me a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, that if he and a liberal liberal economist of equal stature got together in a room, and if they're both willing to engage in principled compromise, they could solve our fiscal problems in an afternoon. Now that was a hyperbole, obviously, but his point was right. These problems are susceptible to principled compromise, but you have to have people who are willing to do that and willing to base their views on facts and analysis and not have bumper sticker solutions, in my opinion.
You mentioned earlier that the large financial institutions of the United States are much better off than they were a decade ago. I do, but I want to broaden it. If you ask about the financial system as a whole, where do we stand compared to a decade ago? What are the risks? What should we be concerned about?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not concerned particularly about the financial system, though I'll mention a couple of things if I may. I'm no bank analyst, and probably some of you know a lot more about banks than I do, but I have a strong impression that the big banks are probably in pretty good shape, even to withstand serious stress. What we did in Europe still is not. To the credit of Obama and Tim Geithner, they forced the banks to recapitalize, and the Europeans have not done that. And as a result, you have some serious possible risks, at least in the EU banking system. I still think, as I thought ever since I was at Goldman Sachs, that derivatives did not play a meaningful role in the 08 crisis. But I still think that derivatives could create problems going forward. And I thought back when I was at Goldman Sachs, and I tried to get support for this, but there was no political possibility of it. I think margin and capital requirement. See, the financial reforms after the crisis did deal with derivatives, but mostly to put them in central marketplaces, stuff like that. What I thought they should have done, and I discussed at the time with policymakers, but I think they may not have been doable politically. I think they should have increased margin capital requirements. First place, gives you more cushion, and secondly, it would reduce the use of these. And I wonder about hedge funds. Sebastian Mallaby, some of you may know his name, wrote a book on hedge funds, and he argued that if hedge funds are providing a lot of the financial function, extending credit, one thing or another, that's a lot safer than banks because it's diversified. I'm not so sure about that, and I talked to Sebastian a lot about it at the time, because you can get a run on hedge funds, and once some hedge funds get in trouble and they start selling the stuff they have, since there's a similarity of position across the hedge fund world, You can see that building on itself. So those are two thoughts. There are probably some I'm not thinking about, but those are two come to mind. You have another one in mind?
Well, I'm going to move on because it's just a follow-up to what you just said. You mentioned earlier that when you think about regulation, you think about costs and benefits. Are we balancing them appropriately now? If not, where would you make some shifts?
Yeah, but it's not in the financial. My guess is that on the financial, and I'm no expert in financial regulation, Kim, but my impression, just talking to a lot of people who actually do know something about it, that's probably not in bad shape. I mean, I would do something in derivatives, like I said. Unfortunately, Dodd-Frank took away some of the powers of the Fed that were really important. Yeah, that was unfortunate during the crisis. If we have another crisis, there will be some powers they don't have that they had then. But I think the place to worry about it, there may be many places, but I think the place I most worry about is the environment. Climate change is existential. And in any event, environmental conditions are part of the world that we all live in. And as we know, it's an externality in terms of GDP calculations. We don't have a green GDP. And my strong impression, though I don't profess expertise in this, is that there's been a lot of deregulation that on a cost-benefit basis you would not have done if you gave appropriate weight to the benefits of sound environmental policy.
Well, following on that, carbon tax, any thoughts on?
Oh, yeah. Look, if you speak to mainstream economists any place, almost all of them will say, if you're going to deal with climate change, the centerpiece of your approach has to be a carbon tax. And it's got to be an adequate carbon tax in amount. Now, an immediate objection that a lot of people have is it would be regressive. And that is, of course, true. So then what you do is you need to create some sort of mechanism for rebating. Look, people would like to use a carbon tax to do infrastructure and do a lot of other things that we need to do, but then you really do have a regressive tax. So I kind of think that if we're going to have a carbon tax, it probably is going to have to be constructed with some sort of rebate system that is progressive. There will still be winners and losers because inevitably that has to happen. And then around a carbon tax, you would need some regulatory measure, and you would need some in public investment because it isn't going to. There are areas of risk that it isn't going to reach, and then you're going to, unfortunately, because we've already gone so far down the road that we've gone in, we're going to need a lot of adaptation expenditure, protecting seaports and all the different issues that we know about. Can I mention one other thing in climate change?
Yeah, please.
I think if I were the EU, I would be deeply focused on the effects of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, because I think as it makes sub-Saharan Africa more and more difficult to live in and more difficult to work in and more difficult to create economic activity, it's going to increase tremendously the immigration pressures that you're seeing from sub-Saharan Africa already, but great multiples. And Europe obviously doesn't want to have that great increase in immigration. I don't know what's going to happen, Kim, but it's going to really... Look, we have the problem at our border now, too, but in a much smaller way than I think they're going to face.
Yeah, I mean, demographically, I highlight for my students that virtually all of the population growth that's expected on the planet in the rest of the century is in Africa. And it's something that people in Europe and everywhere else are going to have to deal with.
I don't see how it happens, Kim, because if they can't... If sub-Saharan Africa really becomes a place where it is much more difficult to conduct economic activity and much more difficult to live, well, maybe it will take place there, but I think it's going to inevitably, the pressures to move it are going to be just enormous.
Understood.
I think. I may be wrong.
So earlier you expressed some optimism about the resilience of the political system in the United States.
Yeah.
And yet today we have a very polarized Congress and a somewhat polarized electorate. How do we deal with it in the here and now?
You mean right now?
Now, next year, trying to make some progress.
Look, all right, but the next couple of years are going to be tough because people are positioning themselves, in some measure at least, for 2020. And that makes it very difficult to make progress. I still think there's some things we could make progress on, but I don't know what the probabilities are. For example, pharmaceutical prices. I certainly don't profess any knowledge or expertise on this, but the people who have expertise that I know, and I know some people who do, say there are some real issues in this. Trump has said he wants to do something about it. The Democrats certainly want to do something about it. Seems to me that's something where maybe you could actually do something. Infrastructure. Everybody wants to do infrastructure. Well, everybody says they want to do infrastructure. Now, how do they want to pay for it? Then you start to get into all kinds of complex questions. Some people think we should deficit fund it. Some people think we should fund it with a carbon tax, but I don't think that could conceive. First, you couldn't get a carbon tax with Congress today. So and secondly, you have the regressivity problem I mentioned before. So I think probably the two areas we have the best chance of getting something are pharmaceutical drugs and infrastructure. Am I forgetting something? No, I think that's probably. But what the odds are in this highly polarized environment and with the tremendous focus right now on positioning for 2020, I don't know.
Does the political polarization affect the attractiveness of the United States as a place to invest?
Well, by the way, if I were a politician and I were running for office, and I'm not, I probably would be a horrible. I tend to say what I think, and that makes it maybe not such a great candidate. But it would be interesting to see if there are some candidates who basically are thoughtful, apply a real seriousness of purpose to policy issues, and then can find some way to make that politically resonant, can make some way to make complexity, an explanation of the complexities of policy, the complexity of the challenges and the complexity of policy politically resonant. I'll tell you who was really good at that was President Clinton. He really and truly was. And even he found it very difficult on a lot of these issues to discuss them in ways that worked politically. So but time will tell.
Just a few weeks ago, Mike Froman was here.
Oh, did Mike speak to the same group?
But slightly smaller. Well,
you should, if you weren't here, you should have been. He's an extremely capable individual.
Former U.S. trade representative, and he said that President Obama had given him a mandate. One of the mandates was to encourage a consensus in the Congress, and he came back and said, "I did that, but it wasn't the one that you expected." Every side disagreed with the idea of promoting trade.
Yeah,
so
Mike has said that to me too. Well, and more broadly, they all sort of agreed on disagreeing. Yeah, it was sort of.
Okay, so just trying to make sure. Oh yeah, suppose that the Democrats win the presidential election of 2020. What advice would you give the next Treasury Secretary?
Well, let me ask you a question. Are you saying they have the presidency, the House, and the Senate, or not?
I'll let you decide that.
Well, no, but you can't. You'd be a good pollster. You'd frame the question the way you want to get the answer you want. No, that makes all the difference in the world. If you have reconciliation, look, you all know this, but if there's a whole range of issues that relate to the budget that can be, under Senate rules, can be passed with a 50%, well, 50 votes plus one, 51 votes, and that's called reconciliation. So it's all these budget issues. No, it's not true. It's not all the budget issues, but it's a lot of issues that relate to taxes and fiscal matters and budgets and things of that sort. Healthcare. If you have all of it, then you can think about one kind of set of policies. If you don't, then you've got to think of ways to reach across. But you know what I would say to a Secretary of the Treasury? But here's what I would say. When Larry Summers and I were there together, and we were there for quite a while, well, our view was that it was our role in the world, if you will, in our political system, in our administration, was to stand for seriousness of purpose around policy. There are plenty of people who do politics. Oh, I think we were reasonably conversant with politics, but it was our business to give serious thought, sort of what I've said before, Kim, serious thought to the issues that the country faced, recognize the complexity, come up with responses that we thought made sense, and that were commensurate with the complexity of the issues, and then using sort of a probabilistic approach to everything. I mean, there are no certainties in life, in my opinion, so you figure out the probabilities of various consequences of what you're recommending, and then you try to optimize, so you get almost a policy expected value, something you're used to as MBA students for other purposes, a policy expected value. And then you go to the president and you do truth to power, and you tell the president what you think. And if the president agrees with you, fine. If he doesn't agree, you debate with him, and then ultimately he makes a decision. So that, I think, is the role of a Treasury Secretary. And that's what we tried to do, as did Hank and Tim and others. Though not all.
You sort of answered this, but I'd just give you a chance to elaborate on it. President Trump has had a focus on bilateral trade deficits.
Notice that.
I'm wondering how you and others that you respect react to that. That's one. And if the arrangements with China address only the bilateral trade deficit, where does that leave us? Will that be registered historically as an important achievement or not?
Hey, correct me if this is wrong, Kim, but I don't think there's no economist I've ever run into who thinks that our bilateral trade imbalances in either direction, surplus or deficit, are relevant to anything. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I'm guessing that Peter Navarro would disagree.
Okay, but I've never met Peter Navarro.
Me neither.
And undoubtedly there are other people like that. But if you take I bet you I'm in the 99% group. Okay. Look, I think this is very worrisome because we can't tell China what kind of economic system to have. If they want to have a sort of state-directed capitalism, that's their business, and it may work very well for them. I kind of think China's probably going to do well over time, although they face a lot of challenges too. A lot of challenges, in my opinion. But we can't tell them what kind of economy, just like they can't tell us what kind of economy we should have. But the problem becomes that their state-directed policies are intersecting with trade, and that affects us in the trade environment. And so there, I think we've got to find some way, Kim, to compromise. And Mike Froman, if he were here now and you'd asked him, Mike had some really good ideas about how to do that. But so we've got to find some way to compromise so that we can have an international trade regime that operates in reasonable norms, but at the same time doesn't involve us trying to say to China, your economy should be a market-based or anything else. But there are going to, but it does. There's a fair bit that China's doing right now that I think is really highly problematic in that respect. And I think if we have a treaty it won't be a treaty, it'll be an agreement, I guess, an agreement that only deals with the bilateral trade deficit, I think it's not of significant consequence. And I think that the stresses between our two countries will continue pretty much unabated.
That's the key ultimate point.
I think so, don't
right?
you?
Yeah, I think that what's interesting over the last couple of years is that the differences between U.S. and China have become bipartisan in ways that they might not have been before.
I mean, look, if he drops his tariffs, I mean, if we eliminate our tariffs, that certainly would be good for the businesses in the United States that have been adversely affected by the tariffs. That's good. But it'll still leave unaddressed what I think are the real issues, and so I think the stress will be unabated.
Okay, so Dodd-Frank, we're in the 10th year of Dodd-Frank. Are there, you mentioned one very good example of where there might be negative side effects, that is the elimination of some authority for the Federal Reserve to make loans to individuals, partnerships, and corporations in extremis. Any other negative side effects from Dodd-Frank that come to mind?
Well, I guess I have a couple of comments. I don't think that proprietary trading had anything to do with the crisis. I mean, it may have affected individual hedge funds, but I don't think it had a material effect on financial institutions. So the Volcker rule, it seemed to me, I have great respect for Paul Volcker, but I just don't think the Volcker rule made a lot of sense. And to the extent that it had some effect, it may have reduced liquidity some, although there's so many other institutions now providing liquidity that I'm not really in a position to judge that. But so I think that may have had a slight. I think, as I said before, as I'm repeating myself, derivatives we should have put in higher capital margin requirements. I think the Consumer Protection Bureau was a really good idea. The question is it being run in a way that's consistent with its mission? So that would be my only observations.
Okay. There's some people who argue that because we issue our debt in our own currency, we really don't have to worry about deficits and debts. No. You suggested otherwise. What makes you think that?
Well, yeah, that's modern monetary theory. One thing, let me recommend, you may have all seen this, but if you haven't, there was an op-ed in yesterday's Washington Post by Larry Summers in which he analyzed MMT, not very favorably, I might add. No, look, I think our fiscal conditions even if though they're not having too much negative effect. I think they are having some negative effect right now. I think they are constraining our ability for public investment. At least politically they are, and maybe substantively they are as well. They certainly have reduced our resilience, as we discussed before. If we get into recession or something, we should do fiscal stimulus, but we may be somewhat constrained, or at least more constrained than we would have been if we had a lower debt to GDP ratio. But I think all the other concerns that one has with respect to unsound fiscal conditions, sooner or later, are likely to materialize, and so I just think it's not correct. Now, let's say that you decide, okay, we're going to deficit fund. We have full employment. We're going to deficit fund anyway. We can do it in our own currency. Why worry about it? I think what will happen, and Larry said this in his op-ed, I think he's right. I think you'll have loss of confidence abroad, which means our currency can have a serious problem. I think interest rates will go up because I think people worry about inflation and they'll worry about the imbalance between supply and demand in debt instruments. So I don't think it makes much sense.
Okay.
You don't disagree?
I don't disagree.
Okay.
I think of it as simply an effort to try and have fiscal dominance over the central bank. If the central bank acts independently, it will eventually matter if the Fed keeps issuing deficits.
Let's say the central bank, all right, let's try that though. Even if the central bank were to accommodate, they were to monetize the debt, I think market interest rates, and let's just say they monetize the debt, the Treasury issues massive amounts of debt, the Fed buys them, and the sovereign rate then remains lower. I think private sector interest rates are going to reflect all the concerns that we were just discussing, and I think our currency will.
Either that or you get a hyperinflation.
Or you can get you could, well, but hyperinflation is not so great either.
Not so great.
No. Yeah, you can get hyperinflation.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. And one thing people forget a little bit, and this is a point Volcker used to make when he was at the Fed, it was a long time ago now, and that is once inflation starts, we don't have much inflation right now, but once it starts, it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle, because as you were saying to me last night when we were talking about it, you get inflationary expectations, and they start to build on themselves, and that's a very hard dynamic to change, except as Volcker did, through very difficult policies.
Big change, big regime change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Since the corporate tax cuts, we've had a big wave of stock buybacks. How do you view that? How do you view the corporate tax cut and the stock buybacks?
Well, the corporate tax cut I thought was a terrible idea, and I wrote 2 op-eds on it for the Washington Post. I called it a fiscal tragedy. It adds about $2 trillion, give or take. It's estimated to add about $2 trillion to our deficit, to our debt rather, deficits or cumulative deficit debt, over 10 years. 1.5 billion was allowed for in the measure, and then you've got debt service on top of that. And if you also extend the tax cuts that were sunsetting, you probably get out to 2.4 trillion or something. If you have a dynamic scoring, then you take that away. So maybe you get, I think the CBO, if I remember correctly, you can check me, but I think they actually credited the thing with about 400 billion or something of dynamic scoring. But most estimates, we put it all together, get you to about 2 trillion over 10. In terms of growth, Goldman Sachs put out something some time ago saying they thought it was contributing about 0.3% to growth in 2018. It'll be less in 2019 because most of the stimulus will be over. And over 5 years, I actually don't remember now what was in the report and what they told me, so I maybe can, let's take this now away from Goldman Sachs, because I'm not quite sure what they put. No, because I don't remember exactly what was in the report. But I think it's a prevailing view that over 5 years, maybe you get 12.5 basis points of average growth, and over 10 years, 5 basis points. It's de minimis. And that doesn't count most of the negative effects on confidence, on markets, the risk of crisis, inability to do the public investment. Doesn't account all that. If you do all that, I think you actually have a negative effect on growth.
Okay.
It was terrible. It was a terrible piece of legislation.
And the stock buybacks, you view that as a result of the corporate tax cuts or something else?
Well, it's repatriation, I think, too, and the tax cuts both. I don't have a strong view on this. I think you're better off allowing them than not allowing them, because I don't think if you don't allow them, I don't know that would increase investment very much. But I don't really know the answer to that. My instincts it probably wouldn't. And meanwhile, if you have buybacks, you recirculate the capital to places where and people where it'll be used. But I don't have a strong view on that. Yeah, I think I maybe do. As I think about it, are you really going to increase investment if you don't allow buybacks? I don't think very much.
It could go the other way. It could go in the sense that firms believe that they're going to be constrained in how they use their resources.
I think that's kind of right. Yeah. I think that's kind of right.
Looking back, your days at Treasury, what outcomes, what actions are you most proud of when you look back today? What successes would you highlight?
I think something you have to remember about any administration is ultimately the president. Every significant decision ultimately comes to the president. And so what you need to have is a president who cares about policy. Let me put it in the context of President Clinton. He cared enormously about policy. He had tremendous serious purpose about policy. And he used politics as a way of trying to get his policy into place. He used to say, all the good policy in the world won't matter unless you have good politics, which is true because you have to implement stuff. At least anything has to go to Congress. So in that context, it wasn't me at Treasury, it was President Clinton. And he had a terrific team around him. We had real process too. You know, that's another thing, Kim, people lost sight of. Process makes a lot of difference. And if we made an economic policy decision, it was because you had a whole bunch of people around a table in the new economic, he created this National Economic Council to be like the NSC. And then we'd all discuss it and we'd bring him a recommendation and he would do whatever it is he chose to do. And interestingly about him, if nobody if we're unanimous, he would say, what's wrong with, what's the opposite, what's the argument on the other side? And he also said to us, I'll never forget this, during the transition, he said to us, I'm going to be president of the United States. It's a pretty big job. But if you all don't tell me what you really think, I'm dead. And he really wanted that. What did we do? What did he do that I think? I think that the dean said, we changed the fiscal trajectory of the United States. That 93 deficit reduction program was very tough politically. We almost didn't get it passed, but it really began a process. And to his credit, George Bush had done some stuff before that. But although he increased taxes, he also had unrealistic assumptions so that the projected deficit actually got worse rather than better. And then we had the 93 deficit reduction program, and then on a bipartisan basis, 97 balanced budget agreement, which was, I think, really very powerful. The Mexican support program, Kim, as political people told him, if this doesn't work, it could be terrible trouble. And we told, Larry and I told him, we think the probabilities are good, but there are no guarantees, and this could not work. And he said, and this was right after he got killed in the 94 elections, remember, midterms. And he said, look, my job is to do what we should do. We're going to do it. And we did. Asian financial crisis, I would say the same thing. China accession, WTO, I think. NAFTA. I was against welfare reform, and that's public. I'm not saying something. I was afraid people would fall between tracks. But some people think that was really good. We never did put in place the kind of cost-benefit framework we should have for regulation, because that's very, very hard to do in the structure of our federal government. But in retrospect, if it was something I wish we had done more of, it would have been that, probably. At least that, there are a number of things I wish we had done more of. That was one of them.
You mentioned several financial crises in that discussion. Mexico, Asia, et cetera.
Russia.
If I remember correctly, Russia. If I remember correctly, Mexico occurred, it came to a peak on the day that you became Treasury Secretary. Maybe you want to tell people a little bit about what that's like?
I didn't get sworn in some big ceremony. My wife and I went to the Oval Office. There were half a dozen other people there, political people, mostly Larry was there. I think Greenspan was there. I think he was, I'm not sure. And the president swore me in. And then I said, Mr. President, Larry and I would like to stay behind and discuss something with you. He said, what's that? And I said, well, so we stayed with President Clinton and a few of the political people, and we said, Mr. President, Mexico's coming apart. And if this thing really becomes what it looks like it's going to become, not only is it terrible for Mexico for the long term, not just now, but for the long term, it can have a lot of adverse effects on us, and it can have a contagion around the global economy. So what we think is we should put in place, I think at that point we were saying a $25 billion program. I think that was the number we used, along with the IMF. Now, $25 billion doesn't sound like anything today, but in the context of that world, it was a lot of money. And we were going to do it with the IMF. And we said to him, Mr. President, as I said before, there are no guarantees this thing's going to work. We think it will, but they may not. The political people were there. The political people said, Mr. President, if this thing doesn't work, you've got a heck of a problem. And there were some of the political people, I think, who had a lot of reservations about our doing this. But he thought about it for a while, and he absolutely related to probabilistic decision-making. And he said, at some point, he said, look, this is what we got to do. We're going to do it. And we did. And there were a few times, Kim, after that, where it came very close to not working. There was even a time when I called Guillermo Ortiz, the finance minister of Mexico, and I said, Guillermo, we've got a problem. This thing is not working. We may decide to discontinue it. And he said, you can't do that. I said, well, let's say we're gonna. I'm saying we're thinking about it. He said, let me come to Washington. We sat down with him in Washington. We got Leon Panetta involved, who was chief of staff at the time. And we all concluded, let's keep going, but let's recognize if this doesn't work, we may have to stop it at some point. But it turned out it did work. You want to hear an irony?
Sure.
Through the whole time that we were doing this, Alphonse D'Amato, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, opposed what we were doing. And he had terrible hearings in which he was really, they were quite unpleasant to us. After it succeeded, he put out a press release saying that with the leadership of the Senate Finance Committee, this really happened. The Mexican support program has now worked. I mean, this is the world we lived in.
Success has many owners.
Yeah, but this was kind of outrageous. And I'm not being critical of D'Amato. I'm just reporting an historical fact. No, I'm serious. I'm not being critical. D'Amato was a very important senator for a long time, but that isn't what I just said is historically factual.
So we've had an experience recently where a large firm has been able to go around the United States and trying to invite competitive bids to attract its business, Amazon.
Yep.
Should we be concerned about that? Is there something we should be doing about this ability to elicit municipal subsidies for corporations?
They weren't getting a municipal subsidy, just to be clear. The people who opposed it said that they're getting a $3 billion subsidy, and we could use that for transportation. It was not a subsidy. It was a rebate on the taxes that they would have had to pay. So now, instead of getting I've forgotten the estimates now. I think there were 25 or 27 billion was estimated the likely tax revenues to New York over some extended time. I don't remember how long. We're getting nothing. So they're getting nothing, and we're getting nothing. So I don't think that was very good. No, there is a problem. It is not constructive having states bid against each other. There's no question about that. On the other hand, I'm not sure what you do about it. What would you do? Get a federal law that preempted the right of states to bid for economic activity, and how would you word that, and how would it apply? So yes, it is counterproductive to have states bidding against each other, and I don't know if there's a solution to it. I've heard a lot of people discuss this, as probably some of you have, but I've never heard anybody propose something that would be responsive to that problem.
It's not limited to the United States. It happens in many countries.
Sure.
Provinces competing for business. So,
and countries competing.
And I don't know of a country that's really solved the problem. So if there is a solution, I'm looking forward to hearing it.
And countries competing, Kim.
Yes.
With each other.
Yep. So in that context, countries competing, the U.S. has had this enormous benefit from being the reserve currency supplier in the world, partly based on reputation. There may be other countries that want to compete for that role. Are there any serious competitors today? Is it the U.S.'s business to lose? In the sense that we give it up.
Yeah, no, I get it. You asked a question before that I didn't quite respond to, which is this. Do I think the political dysfunction in the United States today is going to cause people to be less inclined to come here to do business? I think my impression is it's having some effect maybe, but not very much. I think a lot depends on 2020 and what the outcomes of those elections are. Look, I don't think there's any question that this administration in its actions has created very serious relationship problems around the world and has affected adversely confidence around the world in us. But I don't think right now it's had that much effect. I think after 2020 could make a difference. Also, the rest of the world is not doing so great. The EU is I don't mean disrespectful of those of you who are here from the EU, but it reminds me of the Titanic. Well, all right, well, okay, but it's not in such great shape. And China, although I think China will do, my instinct is China will do fine over time. They have a lot of problems too, and a lot of issues, and it depends. If you haven't read it yet, what's his name? The guy at the Peterson Institute.
About China?
Yeah.
Oh, Nick Lardy.
Yeah, Nick just wrote a new book on China. It's worth reading. What he basically says is they can do very well if they continue to move toward a market-based structure, still recognizing they'll have some form of state capitalism, and they could have a lot of trouble if they move away from it. And I actually in fact, I blurbed the book. It's got a nice blurb from me on it. It's worth reading or skimming at least.
I agree. Since I wrote a blog post telling people about the book, I think it's a pretty good book.
Yeah.
One of the people in the audience is interested in cryptocurrency.
And there are different demographic problems in China too. I mean, they're going to have a declining population at some point. That's a problem.
The working population's already started to go.
Yeah, so that's a problem. They have plenty of problems, issues, political issues, one thing.
One of the people in the audience is asking about cryptocurrencies. Do you have views?
I know so little about it that I'm a wrong person to ask based on the very, very little about it. What do you asked me whether I would own some?
Well, that's one way to ask the question.
Well, I mean, that's sort of it's a way of summarizing your view. I wouldn't. Yeah. No. Now, that's different than the underlying structure, which we all know may have significance, right? Yeah. But the currency, I wouldn't. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the people who own cryptocurrencies will make huge fortunes out of it, and I will turn out to have missed something. But I wouldn't own them.
Okay. Okay. So this person is asking about whether our central banks, our regulators, are somehow fighting the last war. Are they missing the threats to the system, the financial system? Is there a crisis brewing that we're not paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd call them central bank. I mean, central banks are not omnipotent. They can't solve every crisis. It's one of the things that Greenspan used to say. Yeah, they're important. You can debate how important. I guess I'm inclined to think they're a little less important than maybe some other people are. But your bond market can certainly disassociate. Remember when Greenspan, and I don't remember when it was anymore, but he lamented the fact that the bond market was disconnecting from Fed funds rates. Remember that? So those things can happen. So I'm a little less focused on the Fed maybe than on central banks and a lot of people. But I think our fiscal conditions in the United States, I agree with Jay Powell. He said the other day in some kind of statement, I've forgotten where it was, that our fiscal conditions are a real threat in longer term. I think what's happening in the Eurozone is very troubling. And who knows where that's going to head. But it's hard for me to see how that's going to get pulled back together again. Mario Draghi, I think, has done let me say in full disclosure, he's a very good friend, and we vacation with him and stuff, or have vacationed with him, haven't lately. But I think he's done an outstanding job. But I think the thing is immensely stressed, and they're not, as far as I can tell, none of the Euro-wide issues are being resolved. Eurozone-wide issues, I should say, are being resolved. And who knows? China, I think China is likely to do well, but there are risks there too. But those aren't central bank risks.
You were famous for saying from time to time that a strong dollar is in the U.S. interest.
Yeah.
President Trump, on the other hand, has been arguing for a weaker dollar from time to time.
I've noticed that.
So, something we should be worried about?
Well, a weaker dollar. Does he really want a weaker dollar with all that can portend? And if once, in some sense, you could say, how much can he do about the dollar? And there really isn't. This is the funny thing. When I was Secretary of the Treasury, journalists would always say, "You in favor of a strong dollar?" I would say, "Yes," because I am in favor of a strong dollar. And they would say, "Okay, good," and they'd write that up, and people would be happy. The reality was, there wasn't much we could do about the dollar. Yeah, we can intervene, but I think there's ample evidence that intervention doesn't work very well. We only intervened, I think, 3 or 4 times. Now, what we did do is when we intervened, it mostly had to do with Japan in those days. In fact, I think it all had to do with Japan. We did it by working out with the Japanese that we would say we're intervening, but we also put out a policy package that the Japanese bought into, or at least said they bought into, and would implement. And I think it really was the policy that created an effect, not the intervention, except maybe in the very short term. Now, a central bank can have an effect on a currency, but that's not the administration. But I think there's relatively little. Public policy can have a tremendous effect on the currency. For example, as I said before, it's modern MMT, modern monetary theory. I mean, that could have, if you really go down that route, that could certainly have it in a negative sense. But I think having an administration talk about a weak dollar is not a constructive thing to do, even if it in some sense doesn't have much significance. I don't think anybody took it very seriously, by the way.
Well, I think that they would, depending on whom he appoints in the future to the Federal Reserve. If he appoints people who actually articulate the goal of having a weaker dollar,
No,
that could change.
That would be a big. But I don't think anybody has.
Not yet.
Know.
That hasn't happened.
And I don't know when the next vacancies are. No,
there are vacancies.
There are? How many?
Yeah, 2 vacancies. But he hasn't appointed anyone who's articulated that view.
2's not so bad. No, that would be an immense problem.
Okay. So, oh yeah. Where was I? I was thinking about taxes. You mentioned the idea that we would probably have to raise revenues, and there have been people who've called for a wealth tax. There have been people who've called for a top marginal income tax rate of 70% at the federal level. You didn't list those 2 in your list of things that you would propose.
No, I didn't. Look, a wealth tax, for one thing, there's a constitutional question about whether you could even do it. Secondly, I defy anybody to figure out how they're going to make that work. I own a small business. Am I now going to value it every year? And then once I value it every year, is the IRS going to come and audit and value it every year? Half the American population would have to work for the IRS. All right, it's a job creation act then, in some sense. But, so I don't think, I actually think it is unworkable. I also think there's a problem with it. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think it doesn't project what you want to project about our market-based economy. Maybe I'm wrong about that, I don't know. But I think for other reasons, it's not someplace to go. Also, it would take a tremendous amount of political effort to get it done. Even if you could get it done, it'd make it undone sometime. I think what you ought to do is take your political, so this is a different point, take your political capability and political capacity and focus on things you can do. And base broadening certainly is one of them that I think you should. Now, every exemption and credit, obviously, and deduction has friends, so that's not so easy either. But that might be a better path to go. Getting rid of stepped-up basis of death, and people understood it. That's the trouble, is people don't understand. If people understood it, they certainly would do away with it. And that would help in terms of inequality as well, obviously. Increasing the state tax, I would do that. 70% rate, look, I don't know. Somebody's have to sit down and try to do some kind of analysis as you start to raise rates. What kind of effects, if any, negative effects do you have on the economy? And somebody will have to try to make some judgments about that. My guess is that the system is never going to move itself towards 70%, but it certainly could go above the 39.6 that we had well, I guess since we were there, actually.
So there are students in the audience who may be thinking about a career in finance or a career in public policy or a variety of other areas, some of the things that you've done in life. What courses of study do you think you would recommend them to be following for that?
Well, I'll tell you what for me, I can only speak for myself. And I actually had a New York Times op-ed about this. And you might find it, it's not that long, so if you want to read it, it's only 800 words. I think more than any, look, if you're in finance or you're in political, in the policy world or in the political world, whatever you do, you're going to be making decisions your whole life. And ultimately, the success or failure of what you do is going to depend on the quality of your decision making. And I think that I took philosophy 1 at Harvard, and I had a professor, Demos. And he started by taking us through the great thinkers of the ages, and I understood some of it, some I didn't understand. Quite a bit I didn't understand, actually. But I kind of could grade in the course somehow or other. But anyway, but then after a while I began to realize something, that Professor Demos, there was an underlying thrust to what he was doing, which is that there are no provable certainties. And that started to come through from what he was doing. And therefore, everything is about probabilities, which, by the way, is what modern science says. But everything is about probabilities. Once you get to that point, then you recognize that all decisions are complex, are inherently complex, or at least all significant decisions, and they're all about probabilities. That drives you to try to understand whatever you're dealing with as well as you can, and it leads you to making decisions of the kind that we recommended to President Clinton, which is to say, we think the probabilities are this, but you could also not work. It also leads you to contingency planning, which unfortunately very often is not done. So I think more important than anything else is how your mindset, your Yeah, your mindset's not a bad way to say it. Your mindset with respect to decision making, and however you might get to the point that I've just, and then internally, Stan Fisher, who had been chair of the economics department at MIT, and then became second in command at MIT, and then he was deputy chair of the Federal Reserve Board. Stan said to me once that most thoughtful people sort of recognize that decisions should be based on probabilities. He said almost nobody has internalized it. And I think what you've got to do is get yourself to the point where you've internalized it. And I think that's what Professor Demos really led me to that. He really did. It was I think it was the single most important thing that happened to me in terms of what I did with my life and my career.
So it wasn't a Foundations of Finance class or an Economics 101.
Without meaning to be disrespectful, I never took a Foundations of Finance. I actually think economics is a really good major because you need to understand the economics, but you need to understand if you're going to do any of the stuff that I've done. But no, with all due respect, it's what I just said.
Okay.
I don't mean to diminish the importance of what you do, but I'm just saying what I do.
I don't teach Foundations of Finance anymore.
Okay. Yeah, but you teach something in that area.
That's right. Close enough.
You're the
I'm
Henry...
not teaching what Professor Demos did. That's true.
No, you're the Henry Kaufman Professor of what? Something.
Financial history of financial institutions and markets.
Okay, so there you are.
I'm glad I remembered that. Okay, so foreign affairs. The recognition of the role of the United States in the world for 70 years after World War II was as a leader in trying to promote global solutions, multilateral mechanisms, the World Trade Organization, et cetera, et cetera. Have we lost that? Are we able to go back to that?
I think that's a really important question, Kim. Kim knows this. I have a certain amount of interaction with foreign political leaders or policy leaders or thinkers or whatever you want to call people. And I don't know. I mean, people are around the world, there's tremendous concern now about the United States. We have been the sort of the fulcrum, if you will, or I don't know if it's the right word or not, but I think it is the right word, the fulcrum for a lot of international activity, international alliances. And sure, countries would disagree with us one thing or another, but we played a major role in the world in many respects in maintaining stability and maintaining an open trading regime. We did in climate change with the climate change agreement. Then we, of course, tragically pulled out of that, but unwisely pulled out of that. But and we're not doing that now. And I think people around the world are very troubled because there's no obvious substitute for us. I think China and the United States together could really perform that function massively in the self-interest of both of our countries. But as we discussed before, there are a lot of voices that aren't looking at that, our relationship that way, looking at national study. Now, can we get this back if we get an administration that is inclined toward that? I've been party to a lot of conversations on that. I think we can, and hopefully we will. But the fact that we pulled out of agreements and pulled out of arrangements that we've made, I think will have a lingering effect on people in the sense, on leaders abroad in the sense they'll say, well, okay, you say you're going to do this, but now I've seen your system is such that you can pull out of it. But I actually feel pretty good about that. I think we can do it. I think we can, I think we should, and I think if we don't, I think it will be tremendously to our disadvantage as well as disadvantage of the rest of the world. The world needs us to be successful. It really does. I don't mean to say that, but it's true. Just like we need China to be successful, as long as we both agree to work together and not in ways that are stress-creating. And by the way, we can be economic competitors, but we should be economic competitors that, in my opinion at least, function within a framework that is sensible. And we can be geopolitical competitors as long as it doesn't create difficult geopolitical conditions that could become quite adverse.
Any comments on the Democratic field of presidential candidates?
You asked me if I have views?
Or views you're willing to share?
No, that's the distinction I was trying to make. Look, there'll be a debate, a multifaceted debate, but one part of the debate will be, is the best way to win in 2020 presidentially? Now, I've been part of presidential politics for a long, long time. And the debate I'm about to, this took place in '72, Kim. I was somewhat younger at the time, but I was there as other people debated. You have a better chance of winning if you pick somebody that is more toward the left, who can really inspire the base, or do you have a better chance of winning if you have somebody center left who can reach to the base, but can also reach more effectively to independents, even Republicans, and what I would call moderate Democrats. So that will be a debate. I myself think we're better off in the latter position than the former position, but that's the debate that's gone on as long as I've been involved in presidential politics, and it will go on here. Where's our best chance of winning? In terms of governing, since I think that we need to recognize complexity and recognize probabilities and have serious purpose around policy, I think that's how we should approach policy without regard to labels. I don't think we should think about labels anyway, but in terms of just the policy positions, I think if we move in terms of governing, we shouldn't govern in terms of bumper stickers. We should govern in terms of seriousness of purpose. In terms of the politics of 2020, I think you'll have the debate I just described.
Great. Any final comments you'd like to share with everyone?
Yeah, I wish you good luck. You're going to need it. I guess I'd say one thing. Whatever you all do, and this was true for me, and I think it's true for you all, I would combine two. You take this for what it's worth. I think it's important to be very intense about what you do, but I think it's also important to try to get involved in the world more broadly. And even when you're very young, there are ways to do that. There are all kinds of little things. I did it when I was starting at Goldman Sachs, and I had a job that was very intense, and it really took my energy and my time. But I tried to find little things I could do, work on campaigns, even if you're just people don't put envelopes, I don't think anymore, but they knock on doors, they make phone calls. I raised some money in my minor amounts, and get involved in the world. Or there are organizations that do all kinds of social service that you can get involved in. So I just get involved in the world and make your life more interesting. And actually, it'll better suit you for doing whatever you're doing, because you'll be broader, you'll be more knowledgeable, and that's very helpful in dealing with whatever you're doing.
Please join me in thanking former Secretary Rubin.
Good, great. This was fun. Thank you, Kim.
That was great.
Oh, I enjoyed doing it.